Good to be with you, my friends. We will jump right into Mark chapter 8. Move things, get things in the right spot. There we go. All right. So last time we looked at the end of chapter 7. We saw Jesus go to the Gentile region, to the Decapolis, and heal and teach, and of course feed the 4,000 Gentiles. All of which, again, going back a little bit before that, was his response. Clearly, Mark writes it as Jesus's response to the Syrophoenician woman, who basically says, hey, even the dogs deserve the crumbs. And it seems to convert Jesus's heart to a Gentile ministry that he had not done before that. That certainly seems to be the hinge point that leads him into Gentile territory, right? So today, I start with the last verse of the previous one. We get two stories of Jesus doing the same things and yet new things. No, this is wrong page. Anyway, so I went back just a little bit for 8:10. Is technically the end of the last passage, but it's a geography thing. So, and immediately Jesus got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. That is, he went from the eastern side of the seashore, the Gentile side, back to the Jewish side, where, of course, who should he find there but the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. Yeah. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And they said to one another, it's because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets were full of broken pieces did you collect? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect then? And they said to him, 7. Then he said to them, do you not yet understand? All right, so first things first, Jesus is on the eastern shore where he feeds the 4,000 Gentiles, and it doesn't give us a direct location. It just says in a deserted place or in the desert even. Then he talks about taking a boat to Dalmanutha, or I'm gonna go with that pronunciation, who knows? We assume it's on the Jewish side because, again, he's greeted by the Pharisees, but we literally don't know where this town is. This is one of those archaeological question marks. They think they may have found a town that's Dalmanutha, but they are really not completely sure at all. To give you a rough idea, the Decapolis there is in the bottom right. The feeding of the 4,000 Gentiles, and this is one of the things I love online. You find these maps and they go, this is exactly where the feeding of the 4,000 Gentiles happened. Maybe it's somewhere in that region. It could have been south of there. It could have been north of there. But it's clearly on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, right? And again, we don't know where Dalmanutha is, but at least if you go straight across, that's Magdala. Maybe north of there or maybe south of there was Dalmanutha. Who knows? But we get the idea, at least, of the geography. Now, he gets irritated with the Pharisees because they want a sign. This is something that we hear much more about in the Gospel of John, where people are constantly asking Jesus for a miracle, for a sign, prove that you're the Messiah. This is the first time we really get it here, but it irritates Jesus the same way either time. None of the scholars seem to note that Jesus is well received in Gentile territory. That is, the verses before this are all incredibly accepting. No one's challenging Jesus or saying, prove who you are or anything like that. They're like, they just bring their sick, he heals them, and they seem to believe in Jesus. Then he goes back to Jewish territory, and it's not a good reception. Instead, they want party tricks and favors, right? So he's immediately accosted by Jews in the Jewish territory and gets irritated and immediately just gets in the boat and leaves. He goes, just as an idea, after this, he goes back to Bethsaida as the next town he goes to there on the upper right. So, which is again a Gentile town. For some reason, the scholars don't want to give any credence to that, but basically it sure seems like Jesus has gotten to a point where I can't even be in Israel right now. They're driving me nuts. I'd rather be with the Gentiles, or at least not dealing with some of the drama that the Pharisees create, right? The disciples then don't pack food for the journey. They only have one loaf. And that might be because Jesus just seems really irritated and ready to leave. Could be they didn't have enough time. Who knows? We just know that they only have one loaf. Now, some scholars, and this is where they get into the symbolism stuff, because there's only one loaf. Perhaps they're saying here that Jesus is the bread of life, or one of those kinds of turn of phrase, or it could just be there was one loaf in the boat. I don't know. It's not altogether clear, but they don't have enough food either way, right? And so they misunderstand Jesus and think that he is hangry, right? Get all angry plus hungry. That's the famous line. They think, I mean, and it's pretty comedic. I mean, we have to laugh. If you can't laugh at this, you can't laugh at anything, quite frankly, because it's 100% like, not sure if I'm just hangry or people are really irritating, right? I mean, that's 100% where Jesus is on this one. He gets irritable. They're like, oh, he's just hungry. He hasn't had anything to eat. We only brought one loaf of bread. There's not enough to go around, and he's irritable about it, right? That's 100% what's happening here, at least on the surface from the disciple side of thing. So Jesus warns them about the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians, right? That's the other turn within this. And we have to link this to the Passover. We have to, because it's all about the leaven, right? It's all about, we're in such a hurry to leave Egypt. You don't bake the bread and let it rise, right? You don't take that time to let the yeast or leaven rise. And so you have to, when Jesus is saying, hey, don't eat this leaven that is poisonous and terrible and is unhelpful to us as a community, you've got to start thinking in those terms, like it's about bread, it's about not having leaven, it's about not having enough. It's all those kinds of images are swirling here. So you have to have at least the Passover partially in mind. Mark, that was making that connection pretty clear, right? That this is a new Passover, a new thing is coming because the old has turned rotten. So Jesus then gets rightfully irate with his disciples. Basically, they all say you're hangry or you haven't had enough to eat, which makes him even more mad. But he also has a point. Jesus then goes, hey, I can make bread with a quick prayer, you idiots. I'm not talking about literal bread, right? You watched me feed 4,000 people and 5,000 people, and there was so much left over. Everybody was stuffed, and there were still stacks of food left over. I'm not talking about literal bread. Which, again, you can read, like all of Scripture, you can read this in multiple ways. You can read it as the disciples thinking that Jesus is angry, right? And has low blood sugar and he's getting irritable, which still could be true even if he's getting frustrated rightfully. It can also be that the disciples are just stupid, which Mark loves to proclaim, that they're not really bright and are missing the whole point when Jesus says, hey, don't eat this leaven. They go literal, and Jesus is talking obviously in a much more spiritual aspect or metaphorical. Could go either way, but Jesus is absolutely saying, I'm talking about folks that require party tricks to believe that's not the way faith works. These guys don't believe anything. Even if I showed them a party trick, they wouldn't believe. And by the way, I have shown them party tricks. I fed 4,000, I fed 5,000. What do they want that I haven't already given, quite frankly, right? And just because we keep seeing it, there's another hangry meme that goes around, me before snacks, me after snack. I mean, we have to laugh at it, right? If nothing else. So what else do we hear in this part of the story?
Jesus is
I'm saying the Syrophoenician woman had a lot bigger impact than I ever had thought.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, it's almost, I'm just going, wow. Okay.
Certainly than we give her credit for most of the time. That's for sure.
Yes.
Jesus is being very human, showing his emotions to be very, very human.
Mhm.
He needs a Snickers bar.
He needs a Snickers, yes.
Yeah, it does.
Craig, you were going to say something, or?
I was going to say exactly what Nettie just said.
He needs a Snickers bar.
No, the human
That is
part.
human.
But I don't disagree with the Snickers part.
Yes.
Heart.
All right, we'll keep plugging along. We got a little ways to go, so we'll just hit the next. So they came to Bethsaida, that is in the northeastern section, and some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." All right, so now we have the healing that doesn't take, right? And there's not a reason for why. Again, Mark doesn't give us the luxury that a Luke or Matthew does and says, this was to show blah, 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 right? There's no connective tissue. It just is some random healing that happens and starts and fits. Read some different theories all around Jesus showing his power. It's amazing how often scholars will spend a lot of paper and ink trying to say, oh, this proves Jesus's power wasn't complete in Gentile territory, or oh, this is a way of Jesus showing that there's different ways to heal. There's all these kinds of things. I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, but I don't know that that's certainly not a thematic point, and it's just a sort of random process. I do know from a strictly scientific process that we can say that a lot of times when people who have lost their sight get it back, it takes a while, not for the healing to happen, but for the brain to process it, right? That this is a very common occurrence. There'll be people who've been blind for a decade because of something, and they've got a new treatment, and they give them their eyesight back. And they'll say it takes them a week or two sometimes just for their brain to start reprocessing all that input. I'm not saying that's true or not here, but there is sort of a scientific, this is one of those times when you can say maybe there's a scientific explanation about this healing as much as there is a profound theological reasoning for it. Who knows? I'm comfortable either way. There is a quote from Ira Diggers, who has an interesting take on it. That is, right after this is with Peter and confessing Jesus as Christ. And so Ira sees this story as critical to connecting what's going on. That is, the healing of the blind man requires two stages. The healing of the blind, requires two stages, just as we learned shortly. The disciples need to first realize that Jesus is the Messiah and then understand that he must suffer, right? So maybe Mark is telling this story to realize that sometimes it takes us a while to catch on, which I like as a thematic connection. I don't know. Could go either way. What do y'all think? What would you think are the options here, or do we have to interpret it? Can it just be a healing that wasn't perfect?
Please don't misinterpret me, but does it matter?
No.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay.
I'm not that's not hard to interpret or misinterpret. No, I mean, I don't think there is. I think this is one of those that sometimes people look for meaning in lots of corners, right? And there may not be deeper meaning to it. It may just be, this is what happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And we might have a discussion if, in fact, he did not regain his sight. All right, but he regained his sight. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it is interesting when the healings it basically followed the same steps with the saliva and that, which is a whole bucket of questions, in my opinion. What's the significance of saliva to eyeballs? But it is interesting that he did the same thing in roughly the same way, and it took. Are we to assume that he healed him the second time he touched him? Maybe. That's how I read it, was that it took 2 tries in essence.
Took a little extra work. And that sometimes, I mean, I think we all have that experience in life, right? That sometimes we think we're better, and then it turns out we maybe need a little bit more time to heal, or a little more work to get all the way past something.
Yeah, lots of things in life take 2 tries.
Or 3 or 4.
Or 3 or 4 or 100.
Yeah. And if it takes Jesus that many, then thanks be to God. It's proof that it takes all of us, right? It's not always first time.
Again, he's very human.
Always in Mark, always human.
EFM on Tuesday night. Tuesday night this past week was the Mark night, so I've read ahead and read the whole thing. And we'll talk about this later with you, I'm sure, but Jesus, this isn't the last time in this chapter that Jesus gets just downright mad. Or in this,
not at all.
Book of Mark, not the chapter.
Well, either way. Yeah, don't give away the ending, Craig.
No. Won't steal any more of your thunder.
Right.
I stole some of your thunder for my EFM.
Yeah. No, yeah, he gets mad a lot in Mark, and it's good. It's righteous indignation usually, but it's good to see that he's human, right? Whether he's hangry, crossing the sea, or justifiably irritated because the disciples don't ever seem to get it. Either way, right? And it's in both cases you go, yeah, we've all been there. We've explained the same thing to a friend 5 times and they never seem to catch it, or you are just hungry and angry.
But once again, he's healing a Gentile.
And he is healing a Gentile.
Yeah, he's healing a Gentile.
And it comes without all the drama, right? There's no question about, oh, well, this, then show us, or what does this mean, or anything else. It's just, oh, you healed someone. Great job. There's not a grand inquisition afterwards by the Pharisees of what does this mean, or it's on a Saturday or
Sunday or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In the Warren Carter, A.J. Levine book on the New Testament, when they discuss this, it says that the 2-step healing anticipates Peter's 2 steps in understanding, who the Messiah is. Right. That he confesses, or he says Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, at Caesarea Philippi, but he doesn't really understand what that means. And so the reader is left to figure out whether Peter ever figures it out.
Yes, I think that's fair. Yeah. He certainly doesn't seem to in the Gospel of Mark before the crucifixion, or right. Only partially. Yeah. All right, so we'll shift to that next part because that's obviously where we're headed. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are..." Whoa, what happened there? Sorry. "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. All right, so Jesus is putting some pretty serious miles on his sandal here. He walks 25 plus miles from Bethsaida to Caesarea Philippi. Plus, there's an elevation change of the Sea of Galilee is about 150 to 200 feet below sea level to 1,200 feet above sea level. They're up in the hill country here in the north. So if you're wondering, this is more or less the procession for this chapter, go across the Sea of Galilee and then way up there to Caesarea, almost at the same level as Tyre, which is where, of course, he met the Syrophoenician woman. So he is deep, deep, deep in Gentile territory and in a whole different part of the world, way out of Israel, literally and figuratively both. So the town is named after Herodias's first husband, Philip, or Herod Antipas's brother, right? Who famously killed John because they got married and Philip was still alive and is still alive at this point. Literally, it means Philip's Caesarea, the Caesarea of Philip. That high is just a possessive ending. Then deep in Gentile territory, they're at the site of historic pagan worship. There are lots of temples, and it's now dedicated to the cult of worshiping Caesar, right? The Imperial Cult, where they have started worshiping Caesar as a god. That started about 29 BC. This is around 30 AD. So you're talking about maybe a 50 or 60-year-old town that dedicated to Caesar, to Julius, and worshiping not just Julius, of course, but Augustus and all the guys in between. Well, there's only nobody in between, but you know what I mean. So again, the geography is making a statement. We're deep in Gentile territory at a place named for one of Herod's sons, the site of pagan worship, Herod the Great's sons, site of pagan worship, site of the worship of the new cult, the new imperial cult. It is absolutely everything about this town says this is Rome's home territory, right? This is outside of Israel in every way, shape, and form. And so basically surrounded, fully surrounded by Rome's power, Jesus asks him, okay, who do you say that I am? In that context. And context is everything in any sort of reading, but especially here, right? This is a huge challenge. We are surrounded by the enemy. Now, with all of that on the line, who do you say that I am? And Rome was always clear that to declare a king, any king apart from Caesar equals the cross. It was crucifixion was for political dissidents. The whole point was to say there's only one king, and that's Caesar. And if you even try to do something different, we'll put you on a cross going into town so everyone will see you. After all, what do they put on Jesus's head, above Jesus's head? That he's king of the Jews. That's the great reason for killing him, according to Pilate in the Gospel of John, because he claims to be one opposing Caesar. Right? So on one level, we think, oh, it's just a bunch of friends walking on the road, and Jesus goes, who do you say that I am? But another way, you can actually hear Jesus truly challenging the 12 in this moment. Like to even say this out loud is dangerous, and to say it out loud in enemy territory puts us all in pretty big risk. It's just that simple. And so to prove the point, the disciples start by saying, well, some call him John the Baptist, right? Does anybody remember the last person who called Jesus John the Baptist in the Gospel of Mark? There's only one person who says, who is this Jesus guy? Oh, it's John the Baptist, come back to taunt me. It's Herod Antipas.
Herod Antipas, yeah.
Herod. He's the only guy who is called Jesus John the Baptist. So just to sort of reinforce this point of their enemy territory, even the disciples, when they say, who do people say you're? Well, the other king says you're John the Baptist. Right? It's a clever little way of Mark and folks putting this in there. It's a reminder on every level. Then all of these that they list, whether you're talking about John the Baptist or Elijah or a prophet, they're all prophets, right? They're not military leaders. They're not kings in waiting. Even the disciples on that first round are sort of hedging their bets and going like, well, yeah, they think you're a prophet, right? We're not going to go too far down this line. So Peter then finally replies, you are the Christ. And Messiah is the Hebrew form of that same phrase, like we've talked about before. Messiah or Christos just means one who is anointed. It's interesting, the NRSV, which I always use here, randomly decides to translate Christ as Messiah, but it's the Greek that's actually used is Christos. If Mark is writing to say he's the Messiah, then he will write Messiah, like he'll transliterate it into Greek. And so this is just for whatever technical term, it doesn't matter necessarily either way, but it's super clear that Mark wants it to be Christ. The reason Mark wants it to be Christ is because the last time it was used was the first line in the gospel, right? When he says, this is the story of Jesus the Christ. And so the whole, excuse me, question that Jesus, and Mark's been asking the whole time is, who is this Jesus guy? Who is this Jesus guy? This is a big climax moment of who is this person? And Peter is the one, of course, who famously then actually gives the answer of who he is. At least in part, he can give the title, right? He can say you're the Christ. What does he mean? That's the next question, right? So we discovered that not everyone has the same idea of Christ or Christos and Messiah. It's literally the anointed one, like I said, but almost all have the same idea, and I think this is accurate. Whether you think it's a king, a military leader, a prophet, a priest, a sage, every single time it's someone who will restore Israel, perhaps militarily, perhaps spiritually, because some of the readings they have from the Dead Sea Scrolls and the expectations there are almost a purification like they had with Deuteronomy and King Hezekiah rather. No, always get those guys confused. I'm not great with the kings of Israel. One of them has the great Reformation moment with
Josiah?
the kingdom of Israel. Uzziah, yes, King Uzziah. Some think that the new prophet, the new Christ might well then be, or the new Messiah might be one who just has another King Uzziah moment, right? It's not necessarily about taking control as much as purifying Israel and bringing it back to true faith. But all of them have that idea of Israel ultimately triumphant in some way, right? No one has an idea of one who is suffering, which is what we'll get into next. Anything else we want to look at just for the actual confession, and then we'll look at Jesus's correction, shall we call it? And I artificially broke this up, but yeah.
What is the significance, or is there any, that Peter is the one that says that you're the Messiah?
Well, I mean, I think certainly the Catholic Church would say, well, Peter is the rock of the church.
Like the rock of the church. Mm-hmm.
Right. We'll point and say, oh, this proves that he is the one who understands the most. I think you could equally make an argument that would also prove that Peter, like always, jumps out of the boat too soon or says things without thinking about them, sort of does a knee-jerk response and then has to go, wait, I don't understand what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. It's not to say Peter is the exceptionally stupid. It's just that Peter is definitely the exceptionally brass one, right? He's the one who brushes in without thinking as much as anything else. But quite frankly, I do think Jesus likes about Peter, though, that he at least takes a swing, even if he doesn't get it. There's something about that Jesus seems to like. Mm-hmm. Where he goes, you're not even close. But good shot, buddy, good try. You're getting closer than everybody who's being quiet. All right, well, we'll look at the other half then of this famous section. So then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. All right, so there's a lot to unpack, right? First thing that I'm going to do is just Wolfhart Pannenberg said the meaning of the title first had to be revised by linking it to the crucified, so that instead of political liberator, a messianic king, there would be seen a suffering Messiah, right? So this is that sort of what Lynn was saying earlier, and I think others have said multiple times, that perhaps Jesus did not want people to be calling him Messiah because they didn't understand what Jesus meant by Messiah. And so he has to teach them what it is, right? He has to go, no, I'm not a political liberator. I don't claim to be a messianic king. I am a suffering Christ. I am the suffering servant of Isaiah, not the triumphant one that you have envisioned. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I like that idea that this is a little bit of that messianic secret that Mark struggles with or puts out there, is perhaps an attempt by Jesus just to say, I've got to explain this to you guys because you've got all the wrong ideas in your head about, coming in glory and fixing everything in the first 5 minutes, that it's the exact opposite, right? Again, no one expected a suffering servant. No one expected death and disgrace, which explicitly in Jewish law, if you were hung on a tree, and then most likely when they were writing the laws of Moses, they were thinking about hanging, like if you were hung on a tree, that's an extra disgrace, that you were extra unclean. So crucifixion then was not just to die a death, which was already bad, but to die a particularly humiliating or unclean death, right? And no one expected that what Jesus describes is the way things would go. That's not what they had in mind, probably when they signed up to follow Jesus around all of Israel and Syrophoenicia, quite frankly. Peter's response then is natural. People always give Peter a hard time, but this is the most natural response. I don't think any of you, if I said, oh, let's go protest downtown, and they'll probably shoot me in the protest, will go, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go. They'd be like, what are you? No, this is awful. Don't go downtown then. Don't die. This is not a good plan. What are you doing? So again, Peter's response is totally natural. We don't want you to die. I don't understand what you're talking about. What are you doing? Right? I mean, and Peter also does what I think we would all do in that situation. If your friend's sort of talking to the whole crowd, you go, hey, come talk to me. This is not cool. I don't want you to get hurt. In a sort of private response, instead of trying to proclaim it to everyone, to which Jesus famously replies, get behind me, Satan, you're focused on the world. But this is one of those moments where I am deeply both sympathetic and empathetic to Peter, quite frankly. He can be dumb and a blockhead in a lot of ways, but this is the most natural response. Like, no, I like you. I love you. I'm following you all over the world. I don't want you to die. That's not a good deal for anybody. I can also think, if we're really honest, we're still trying to understand the idea of a suffering Messiah. I still think there's a lot about this. There's a reason why we keep telling this story, because it's hard to wrap our head around this idea of, wait, by dying, you win? That really? Are we sure about that? Or by dying, everything gets changed? It's not a logical progression, certainly not by our world, right? Not by the standards of we get to win or we want to win everything. It's not how it works. So real quick then, the cross, and we have to be super clear, was not unknown. In fact, it was the exact opposite. It was a public punishment reserved for political revolt, right? So if you walked into most cities across all of the Roman Empire, you would have multiple people in the process of dying on a cross, because typically they did not put nails in your hands. They just tied you up there and they waited for your lungs to collapse, which could take days or even a week or two. It was a long and agonizing death. And it was always for political revolt, right? It was public, it was brutal, and it was not hidden or unknown or just on a quiet hill somewhere away, tucked away, right? Yeah.
Just a quick question, Bill. You said it was punishment reserved for political revolt, but as I recall, those who were being crucified with Jesus were criminals.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't specify what they did.
I never got that there was anything political about what they had done.
Yeah, I do think it probably was for a variety of things, but it was almost always crimes against the state.
Okay.
Right. So it might have been someone got caught stealing from the till. Someone might have gotten caught attacking a soldier. Maybe not always to the level of that, but it was definitely a reminder that Rome is in charge.
Okay.
I mean, the most famous moment is when they defeat Spartacus, which is, of course, before Jesus' time. But when they killed the Spartacus and the slave revolt, the great moment there is they literally crucify when they capture the revolting slaves, they literally, for I think it was 200 miles, every 50 feet, they put another man up on a cross.
And it was on the Appian Way.
On the Appian Way, on the main road into Rome, every 50 feet, there was another person on a cross all the way into Rome, and they stayed there for years. The bodies were on those crosses for years as a reminder to any slave who tried to do anything like it, right? If you try to rebuck Rome, then this is a reminder that this is what happens to those who do it. And I can't remember, there was some insane number. I think it was like 5,000 men or something like that were crucified at the conclusion of that revolt. So, I mean, it's just brutality on a level that we are not accustomed to anymore, thankfully. So this is the thing that we have to do, that we have to name that first, so that when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, right? He has revolution in mind. It is 100% revolution. Not take up your spear and fight to the death, not take up your sword, but take up your cross. Know that if we're going to oppose Rome, it's going to lead to your death, but it's not going to be a violent revolution, right? Instead, take up your cross. Because usually people would say, pick up your gun, pick up your sword, pick up your spear, like follow me into battle. But take up your cross has much more of like, be ready for the ramifications of what's going to happen, right? So it's not, this is one of those things, we've gotten to a really sloppy place linguistically, right? Oh, that's my cross to bear, right? Like I've got to go feed the cat. It's my cross to bear. And you're like, that is not your cross to bear. That's not how this works, right? This is following Jesus and saying things to power that makes power uncomfortable, is what Jesus is talking about. That's what puts you on a cross. That's what Jesus expressly means, and would have been unbelievably clear when Jesus said it in the first century, right? Howard Yoder, one of the great ethicists, says the cross of Calvary was not a difficult family situation, not a frustration of visions of personal fulfillment, a crushing debt, or a nagging in-law. It was the political, logically to be expected result of a moral clash with the powers ruling his society, right? The political, logically to be expected result of a moral clash with the powers ruling his society. We can say it's the same difference as Dr. King knowing that he would be assassinated or killed because he was stirring up the status quo and people wanted that to stop, right? Not because he had some third sight or ability. He just knew he was pissing people off, right? Jesus is saying the same, like what we are going to do, we're going to say that God loves all those folks, even those outside of the status quo, and that's going to really upset people the same way it does now. We're not different now, sadly enough. We're better, but there's still plenty of people that are outside, right? Looking in that we get upset about saying that for. So,
Bill,
yes, ma'am.
just as an aside, 6,000 slaves were crucified along the 200-kilometer Appian Way from Rome to another city. 6,000.
Right. Yeah.
It's a lot.
That's a lot. And again, it was the logically to be expected result. Part of the story of Spartacus is those slaves knew that if they lost, that's what was going to happen to them, right? They fought pretty valiantly because they knew the other choice was to get killed anyway. You might as well go out with a sword in your hand, for a lot of those guys. But yeah. All right, so not to just nail it to the, just keep nailing on this, but to take up your cross is not to put up with terrible abuse or suffering either, right? So this is where the church has preached this terribly, to say like, oh, Jesus suffered, so we should be ready to suffer. No, not like that. That is not at all what Jesus is saying. He is not saying, oh, it's okay if a woman is, dealing with spousal abuse, or if someone is being sexually abused, they should just put up with it. That is a perversion of everything Jesus is saying about take up your cross, right? It's not about suffering. It is about standing up and naming that abuse is wrong, and to be ready for the consequences of that stand, even if they're death, right? So to take up your cross is to very clearly follow God's standards against the world that has different standards. And if that standard is to expect equal treatment and care and love, and that happens to end up getting you killed, well, then you've done good work. And if it doesn't get you killed, you've also done good work, right? So that's the other side. Jesus is not necessarily saying, go make sure you get yourself killed. This is not a call to martyrdom as much as it's just to say, expect when you're going to name that there's a problem, that people are going to get upset, and sometimes they're even going to kill you. All right, I'm throwing lots out there. It's to bravely put faith into actions, what Jesus is truly saying, even though, wow, we have preached this one sideways and upside down. What do we think? Because this is central to our faith. And yet, wow, if there's something that's misunderstood more, I don't know what is sometimes. I'll ask the question, did what I say make sense, or do we need to unpack it some more? Because I might have unintentionally approved something I didn't mean to.
No, it makes sense, and it's very helpful. It's enlightening about just what I would call crap theology that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
Because even if you don't interpret it to mean staying in a situation that you have control over, I've always heard it or understood it to mean that there is suffering in life. And so sometimes we just have to deal with it. It's not a discussion of defending what's right.
Right. Yeah, that's where it definitely gets twisted in that, well, just get used to suffering. That's part of the existence. And you're like, no, we're supposed to question, and it's the exact opposite. We're supposed to question the suffering, not blindly accept it. At least that's how I interpret. That's how I interpret it. I'll always add that caveat. Someone else could hear me a little different.
Footnotes in the NRSV Study Bible give an interesting comment on verse 31. It says that the translation, which is the Son of Man must undergo suffering, says the translation softens a key Greek term, and that it is necessary. Which is to say, in God's plan, given the historical situation. And in fact, in the Message, it says, it is necessary that the Son of Man proceed to an ordeal of suffering.
Right.
I mean, I can remember Bishop Sims years ago would say, Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection were not plan B.
Yes.
But here we go. You see, now I'm Peter, because I'm still asking the question why.
Right.
Was there no other way?
Right. If God's omnipotent, why did Jesus have to suffer like this to accomplish this goal? Because couldn't there have been another way?
Yeah. Welcome to the world of soteriology. Yes.
Yeah,
Is
thanks.
soteriology is all about the study of how does Jesus save, or why does Jesus save, right? And it's, man, people have spent centuries trying to answer just those questions. Like, wasn't there another option? Or, well, if this was mandatory, why was it mandatory, right? Okay, if this is necessary, it is necessary for Jesus to die. Well, why? Why was it necessary? That's another whole class.
Yes.
And even then, we don't have a clear answer. I can sum it all up by saying we have what we have taught and what we have been, what we have shared and wrestled with, but the church has never given a definitive answer to that question. That is, the church, even at the height of like the councils, the ecumenical councils and all the different eras, never came down with a clear answer of this is exactly why Jesus had to die. It was to save sins. It was to free us from our sins. But even then, the mechanism of what if this, then this is why, and this is how, was never agreed upon. There's different theories, but there's never been the definitive answer presented.
In EFM, in the year 4 for theology, one of the sentences in the first of that book that caught both Anne and myself off guard is that the church had no definitive doctrine on salvation.
For a long while, yeah.
Is there a definitive doctrine now? Because that was the statement. That was one of the sentences in the opening paragraph in Ford's book on theology that we were reading. And so it's just, is this another example of there's no definitive explanation?
Perhaps.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no definitive, but like I said, there have been lots of people who spent a lot of time thinking and praying and coming up with answers. It's just, again, it's sort of this mystery that we have not really, no one has felt completely comfortable penetrating and saying this is the exact one.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an idea, here's another idea, here's some more ideas, some pretty good reasoning behind those ideas, but oof, it's tough.
yeah. I quizzed Mark about this after EFM on Tuesday, Nettie, because I was fascinated by it, and I was so disbelieving that the Catholic Church couldn't have cooked up some kind of doctrine about salvation, because, I mean, the catechism of the Catholic Church is not for the faint of heart. They pretty much cover everything.
Yes.
And he said there are a lot of teachings out there, and the Catholic Church may have its teaching, but as far as a doctrine that is universally applied across Christianity, I think Ford's using the word doctrine and the word Christianity very literally.
Yeah.
Maybe so.
To say that there's nothing universal and official from that represents Christianity's teaching on salvation. And it was just like you said, it's so nuanced and it's so complicated.
Well, what was interesting about salvation is today in Daniel's daily message in the challenge and opportunity section, it was endurance and faith, not exaggerated claims and anxieties, is the sign of salvation. So.
Interesting.
So I will, for whatever it's worth, I'll give you my quick soteriology theories, which is basically the main ones are the classic one that in the Western church is substitutionary atonement theory, right? Jesus died before our sins. He died in our place because we are sinful and broken. God is wrathful and angry with us. And to take away that anger and wrath, Jesus has to die to take away that sin, right? That's substitutionary atonement theory. It's what the Baptists probably teach more than anybody else, a lot of evangelicals. It's a very straightforward process of someone's got to pay for the wrongs we did. Jesus takes that on our behalf to open the way back to God. And Stefan's shaking his head. I'm not a big fan either. That ain't my
No.
cup of tea. There's too many issues within it. Whether we go to full penal substitutionary atonement theory, there's lots of different variations. All that said, that's the basic ideas, right? I'm not a fan because it makes God, I don't know why God can't just say, I forgive you, right? That'd be like me saying, the boys, I'm so angry at Mose and Abe because they did whatever, right? Like they put a hole in the wall and they broke an arm and I had to go pay for them to get the bone set or whatever else, right? And I go, well, I'm so angry, someone else has to die. That's a really weird response, right? For God. Even if they're offending against me and call me horrible names, I don't understand that it's consonant with a forgiving God, right? To demand the death of Jesus in that context.
But
That's
it
one.
I just want to add, it did certainly have an impact, though, didn't it, on the
It
world?
is. Well,
Okay, that's kind of where, if I touch any kind of reality or reason, that would be it.
right. Well, it's the most easily preached. That's one of the things that it is easy to put that out there and say Jesus died for your sins, and people go, I can understand that. Like that's not it's a straightforward thought. It doesn't always get behind all the other parts of the reasoning, but it's the easiest one to preach by a long shot. The one that predated that is the one that and I now the term is just flew out of my head, but it's the idea that Jesus lived among us to show a better way, and that is summed up famously by one of the early guys, Bishop. It's not going to come off the top of my. I should have thought we were going to talk about this. Anyway, Jesus became who we are so that we might become who he is, right? Which is this very straightforward idea that
Irenaeus.
is Irenaeus. Thank you. Well done,
You're
Stefan.
welcome.
It's Irenaeus, and it's this idea that we can become more and more godlike because Jesus has showed us the way to God. It doesn't perfectly explain why Jesus had to die, though. That's where I like that theory because I like the idea that Jesus' whole life mattered and not just his crucifixion. And so I really like Irenaeus's idea there, but it doesn't necessarily hit sort of Karen's fundamental question of, but why did he have to die? Right? That one doesn't hit in quite the same way. It's part of that, but it doesn't ever really hit it in quite that same way. That's really the Eastern Orthodox Church is 100% Irenaeus. That's their belief system and what they teach. The West tends to teach much more along the lines of that substitutionary atonement theory. The one that I wrote my thesis on is René Girard, and which is basically he twists penal substitutionary just enough to say it's not because God was angry that Jesus had to die. It's because we as human beings can never seem to accept God's love. In other words, it's not that Jesus had to die because God said so. It's because we keep rejecting him. In other words, we kill Jesus, not God kills or demands of Jesus. For me, that's much more
heavy, though.
What's that?
Whoa, that's whoa.
Yeah, which
So
I'm a
huge murderer now, huh?
Well, I'm a huge Girard fan because it makes more sense to me. Like how many times have we killed the prophets, right? And Jesus is just another in the long line of the prophets. More than that, of course, but it makes much more sense to who I understand Jesus to be and God to be, to say, no, I'm going to keep coming to you in love, even if I know you're going to nail me to a tree in the midst of it. And hopefully that revelation then that here's a completely innocent person, maybe that will indict you that much more to be better, convict you to do more, and to really live into a better life. So in a way, Girard actually is sort of tweaking Irenaeus just enough to say, here's why Jesus had to die. Right? It's just take a bunch of the Irenaeus idea and add on, well, here's why he had to die. It was to show us the evil of the system we've set up, quite frankly, not God has set up. So yeah, there you go. The real light conversation around
Yeah.
around cross and crucifixion and
Mhm.
soteriology. There's 2 or 3 more ideas than that. Like I said, I'm much more of a Girardian, as they would say. But it's also, this is where the church has wrestled because it's not clear scripturally. And certainly the church has never come to a vote or a decision about exactly what we think, because all of them have different problems with the theory, quite frankly. At the end of the day, you sort of look at it and go, well, that's close, but it doesn't quite hit this. And this one's over here is pretty close, but it doesn't quite get that part in. And you're just stuck with sort of partial ideas. So,
It's a good 12:59 cliffhanger.
yeah, there you go.
Mm.
Anything else thinking on or looking at?
Lots
I
of
will
chil-
share. So this is a totally random one. Every year, the Christian Century, it's a great little magazine, puts out books that they recommend. One that probably is right up your line, Lynn. That's a fascinating one that I'm going to have to get is a Native American group just did a Native American translation of the Bible, sort of along the message where it's not an attempt to be literal, but it's more to get to the idea of the idea behind what's being said, but said specifically in ways that are indigenous. So it's another, it might be an interesting way. I'm going to have to get that one just to see, what do they think? Well, how are they going to interpret some of these things in that same way that the message does, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Any other questions? Now that we solved, substitutionary atonement theory and the cross and
I have lots. I mean, I could sit here and talk for the rest of the afternoon about all of this. You do understand that, Bill? Okay.
absolutely, I could too. And I love it. It's good stuff.
This is well, it's heavy stuff. I don't know whether it's good stuff, okay, because it gives me a headache thinking about. But at any rate,
Oh, I think this is
It
the
is.
best stuff because this is, again, Jesus
It
is
is.
pretty clearly saying, be willing to put your life on the line, trying to figure out what we're putting our life on the line for or
Mhm.
about. For me, that's the best stuff. That's the stuff I'd rather talk about that all day than
I agree.
1,000 other political comments that people will make about the, right? Like this is the one you go, no. What are we trying to say as faithful, as people of faith, right?
Good.
All right, my friends. Well, we're at that hour time. Great to be with you, as always, my friends.
Mm.
Thanks so
Thank you,
much.
Bill.
Good to see y'all.
Take care. We'll
Thanks.
see you
Good.
soon.
Enjoy it. Thank you.
Loop me in about meeting dates, Bill.
I will.
Okay, I replied to you.
Bye.
All right, thanks.
Bye. Goodbye, Bill.
Bye.